There's one particular inconsistency within Christianity that drives me more nuts than most of the others. Christians often insist that their Bible is clear, that it is authoritative, and it is revealed, until it isn't. Until someone like myself brings up one of the morally disturbing passages about condoning slavery or killing innocents, commanding genocide, divine deception, hardening hearts, etc. Then a very familiar escape hatch magically appears. God's ways are higher than our ways. God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And I've done an entire video on it before, but I want to look at it from a different angle today. This phrase is a theological kill switch. Moral objections get magically dismissed. Plain reading of the text, that gets suspended for the potential of mystery. And human reasoning is declared invalid, as if there's some other kind of reasoning at play. But here's the problem. Here's the inconsistency. If we grant that principle of God's mysteriousness or his otherness, his being so much higher than us, like us to an ant, if we allow that as an actual excuse to clear away the problematic verses, then it must also allow us to override the pretty or comforting verses. If it only works in one direction, that's not some human humility before the great creator, Yahweh. It would just be special pleading. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to give you just a few examples because we've talked about this so much I don't want to beat it to death, but I'm going to show you a few problematic verses. Then we're going to insert that verse, and I'm going to show you again the excuses that can come for the believer about the problematic passage because of that mysterious verse. Then I'm going to give you some examples of those good verses, and I'm going to be the believer who applies that verse and pulls the rug out from under the good ones. And if you're a Christian and you don't like that, no problem. Let's just agree. Do you want verses at any time to be so vague and open to interpretation and or needing to not even be interpreted, be mysteries left up to God? Then fine, let's do that across the full Bible. Or if you think that I shouldn't get to do that for the good verses, then you need to stop doing it for the bad ones. Pretty simple. In 2 Samuel 24:15, I've mentioned a lot about the ridiculousness of a God who either incited David himself or had Satan incite David, because we get contradicting claims, and then immediately punishes David, actually not David, but gives David 3 punishments to choose from, and he chooses one that doesn't affect him. It affects 70,000 other men that are now dying for the sin of David. So here's one example of, I think, a pretty problematic verse, and it gets deeper. We can go into all the problems about how God said that David only ever sinned one time, and it didn't have anything to do with this census counting. It had to do with the murder of Bathsheba's husband. So God not being consistent with that sin would be one thing. Again, we could just go on for a while to really set up that this is an unacceptable position or verse or happening, occurrence from a perfect, omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving God. And yet, countless times that I've talked about this in the comments, I see, well, Brandon, you don't understand. You have to remember, in Isaiah, we learn that God's ways are higher than ours and his thoughts are higher than ours. So I'm sure, even though I can't articulate it to you, that God had acceptable reasons for what he did. Not just acceptable, but sufficient, like a plan for something greater. After all, we don't know what those men deserved. God's justice, just like his mind and thoughts, transcends our own. Who are we to judge God? And all of a sudden, despite what the New Testament tells us about testing everything and only holding fast to what is good, I'm told I don't have a case, because who can really know? So that's just one example of how this is used. Let me give you one or two more, and then we'll go on to the good examples. You guys have seen this happen yourself when we talk about 1 Samuel 15:3, not just myself, but other counter-apologists that have brought this up even in debates, and hearing from the other side the excuse, by the way, this is a verse that commands the killing of men and women, infant and child. An explicit divine command to kill innocent children. A clear problem for a perfect God of love and justice. Unless you're the Christian that says, don't forget about Isaiah. God's ways are higher. His thoughts are higher. You know, God can see future evil that we can't see. Killing them early was actually merciful, maybe just in ways that we can't really understand. That's what faith is for, Brandon. Okay. Good to know. Plain reading looks like your God is like any other war god of the time, who believes that his tribe, chosen people, are the only ones that matter, and everything else and everyone else is collateral damage. But no, you have a special exception from thousands of years later about this verse that tells us we can't really know God. God's a mystery, which is problematic for so many other things that are claimed about God. And then the first biggest problem is, how do we know we're interpreting that verse correctly? The very verse that tells us God's thoughts are higher than our own. What if, because it's the mind that is giving Isaiah the words for that, we're not supposed to be able to understand that either, or we're understanding it wrong already? No one considers that. No one cares about that. That's exactly the inconsistency that I'm talking about here. But one last bad one so you get the full picture and we'll move on. Call me crazy. I've always been of the mind that a perfect, just, loving, all good God wouldn't be a liar. But that's not what 1 Kings 22:23 tells us, because there the Lord puts a lying spirit in the mouth of all the prophets. It's not the only time that God is more than deceitful even. We have multiple accounts of God intentionally deceiving people, sometimes to their own end and detriment, so that they cannot be forgiven. Someone like me might read that plainly and even in context and say, hey, this is not good. But the Christian will gently remind us of Isaiah. Who am I to judge God? Don't we believe that someone whose mind is higher might be able to use deception on a different plane for some higher purpose? Human categories of truth don't bind things like God. And what I'm not going to do today is take the time to show how each of these particular excuses, even aside from utilizing Isaiah, fall completely on their own and in some way contradict some other needed theology or doctrine about Christianity. But trust me, they do. It's always, in my mind, the clearest scene of the sinking boat. Well, not yet sinking. First, just one hole leaking water in. So you plug it and another one forms. So you plug it and a third one forms. And now the pressure is building up and it's getting bigger and eventually it becomes too much. That's what an honest reading of the Bible, I think, is. An inability to plug all the holes any longer. Because when you do try to patch one thing up, you steal the seal from another of the issues just to patch that one, and now your leak over here is exposed again. Now, the Christian seems to have this amazing ability to act like, well, right now that hole's not a problem. I'm only focused on answering that. I don't have to be consistent between these two. And they'll do it hundreds of times. They'll take that seal off and put it down here. That's a problem now. But hey, we're talking about this. It's bewildering to me. And the good examples I'm about to give you, they sound silly to me. Like, I'm going to say them and I'm going to be consistent in the line of Christian logic about excusing God from his word. But it's kind of hard to do it with a straight face. I wonder if Christians ever have a hard time using this Isaiah verse on the problematic passages with a straight face. So let's get started. I'm going to give you the verse. I'm going to give you what Christians generally accept it to mean. Then we're going to apply his ways are higher and see what different kind of meaning we can make of it. Let's start with an easy one, the prettiest of them all, John 3:16. And we don't even have to read the whole thing. For God so loved the world. How dare you? Have you forgotten Isaiah? You think you understand this God? No, his words are totally different because his mind is higher than ours. His thoughts are higher than ours. His ways are above our own. We don't really know that love means love here, which is a hilarious thing to say. But I can't tell you how many times I've read a verse where God hates, and I'm told, Brandon, you don't understand. Hate doesn't mean hate there. Well, if hate doesn't mean hate, it can just mean dislike less, or it can be a test, or it can be about a chosen or a hierarchy or a preference. Then love doesn't have to mean love. It can mean like a lot. And all of a sudden, with your own logic, we have a God that doesn't have to love everybody. Or maybe I'll take Isaiah and I'll fixate it onto the word world. You know, God's language, God's idea of what a world would be would clearly be so different than our own. You know, to God, maybe world actually means something so great it loses all meaning, something abstract like an entire universe, and we are no longer special. Or maybe it means something really local. After all, for the believers who know better than a worldwide flood, they excuse the tale in Genesis about the flood where it says covered the whole world and things like this as a local world. You know, what the writers at the time meant. Cool. Why does no one do that with John 3:16? World doesn't mean world and love doesn't mean love. We have examples of exactly that in other verses and examples of Christians taking those meanings away. Do you not see the problem? But never once, never one time have I heard any Christian or apologist try to say that John 3:16 doesn't mean what they think it does. Because it's a good thing. It's not a problem. You want a God that loves everyone, and you want everyone to mean everyone. So hopefully you understand what I'm going for here. Like I said, it feels silly because I see how ridiculous this kind of excuse is. but it's the exact same thing. You tell me, for any of the ones you don't like that I'm making, how am I doing it differently than the Christian with the problematic passages? In 2 Peter 3:9, I talk a lot about that verse because it's an indication that God desires that none should perish. But if we apply the verse from Isaiah, I could just mean that desire might be different to God and that it doesn't have to equal intent. God may will mass destruction in some kind of a higher sense. This isn't a God who's actively concerned with every individual on earth. Now, the other problem that I'm running into in my own mind as I prepare for the objections that come up is that there are indeed Christians that already take these verses different than other Christians. There are Christians who have told me that God doesn't expect everybody to be saved. We're typically getting into like the Calvinist kind of ideals here. But they are already kind of playing that different interpretation game to meet their particular agenda. So it's funny because I was trying to give you like this hypothetical, ridiculous reversal to highlight the inconsistency and hypocrisy of Christians and how they apply the text, but you don't need an atheist to make up hypotheticals. Christians already do this to each other. I'm just showing it a bit clearer. Not to be too redundant, but in 1 John 4:8, we read that God is love. Now, a verse like that is problematic to the skeptic because we see in other places that love is not jealous, but that God is jealous. And so if God is jealous and love isn't jealous, then God can't be love. It would seem like we have a problem here. Or if God is love, how does he let all these horrible things happen to innocent people? Or how did he ever come up with the concept of original sin? Or why would hell, eternal conscious torment, ever be on the table in the first place? Well, let me help you out, dear Christian. Even though you like that verse to mean that God really is the definition of love, what if I told you that according to Isaiah, love might look different to God? Love might very well be being inconsistent. That might be God's perfect idea of love, is someone that contains so many multitudes, like Whitman says, that they're not bound to the same small confines of the human mind. It would be nonsense, but it would be unanswer in the same logic that Christians like to use. In John 14:6, Jesus claims that he is the truth. What a claim. If Jesus claims himself as the truth, but I can show inconsistencies between what Yahweh has commanded and what Jesus has commanded, or in their nature, or how they think about the law, and if we're supposed to believe other verses about them being one of the same, part of the Trinity, then we'd have some serious issues with a verse like that. But Christians don't care. God is truth sounds good. We're going to take it as a plain reading. We know what truth is. We know what God is. So, or specifically, this verse was saying Jesus. We know what truth is. We know who Jesus was. So if Jesus says he is the truth, then it's that simple. Why complicate it? Well, that's what I say about all the problematic passages, but it doesn't stop Christians from complicating it with the Isaiah verse to arrive at a different conclusion. In this case, maybe I would say something like, well, what if truth needed to contain deliberate deception in order for a higher idealized version of that truth to exist in some secondary state? Who are we to judge God? You think you understand how truth works? You think you understand how love works? Why? And trust me, the believer has no problem saying to me, you think you know how honesty works? You think you know how reality works? Why? Under that same idea of not leaning on your own understanding, of admitting that God is mysterious and his ways are higher. I feel the need to remind the viewer right now, this is not me being pedantic. I am not being small and purposely twisting insane little things. I am only taking the exact logic that believers do to excuse things they don't like, to excuse things that in this case, the believer likes. You don't have to tell me that you like it. I dare you to try to explain how I would be wrong to do this. And if I am, no problem. You're on my team now. So it's wrong for believers to do that with the problematic passages, especially when they're explained correctly in context, as prescriptive, not even descriptive, like getting everything right. It's clear that the people who wrote this at the time, within the genre that they are writing, within the social context and the audience to whom they are writing, meant something that modern morals today just doesn't like. And so you excuse it with that verse from Isaiah. I see so clearly how wrong and false and hypocritical and harmful that is, and dishonest on top of everything. So again, if you don't like me doing it with the good verses, you need to actually contend with that instead of just cry foul. 1 John 1:9 says that God is faithful and just to forgive us. Confess, and God forgives. Not to say there's not interpretation differences. I mean, just look at Catholicism versus Protestantism on something like confession, and you'll see one that's a bit more literal versus one that's a bit more symbolic. And also, is it considered an act because you have different beliefs as well about faith alone or faith plus works, or if it's just a work that will happen organically when you have faith. Like, it's a mess. But what if I made it messier? What if I said, how dare you, Christian, to assume you understand what to forgive means from the creator of the universe, from the moral arbiter himself? Maybe forgiveness will be withheld for reasons we cannot grasp, and that would be fair, and that would be perfect. After all, we are talking about God here. Who are you to claim you understand how his hand works to erase sin? Psalms 145:17 has the psalmist praising God for always being righteous, righteous in all his ways. Well, I see God do a lot of things that I don't think are just. Again, even from an internal critique, bumping them up against other commands that this same God has given, not my personal ungrounded morality that you seem to have such a problem with. Because you really believe that your God is righteous in all his ways, so who am I? But what if I told you we don't have to believe God is righteous in all his ways? Yeah. If we just apply that verse from Isaiah, justice might include outcomes or commands or interruptions from God himself that we just don't understand. If you think I'm being ridiculous, you have clear verses where God commands the killing of children multiple times that in context would not be hyperbolic. You have the acceptance of sexual slavery for young girls. You have the condoning and commanding of how to own slaves. It's clear as day, in context, within the time and culture, and yet it is the Christian who removes all of that. All that actual word of God because they don't like it. If you read a verse and it's clear, but it's bad, then it's not clear. It's mysterious because of what Isaiah says about God. But if you read a verse that you like that is clear, or even really ambiguous, it's definitely clear. It's definitely the way you think it's meant to be. And we don't have to worry about God's ways or thoughts being higher anymore. That's it. That's the whole episode. It's really that simple. Are you willing to be consistent? And again, I lay before you the 2 ways to be consistent. Remove that verse from how you interpret verses and take God at his word for what he says and judge him by what he says and what he does according to the word you think is from him, good and bad. Or apply your little excuse verse to all the verses, not just the bad, but also the good. And all of a sudden, it seems you can't know anything about God. Either way, I think you're left in a really bad spot, which is probably why you have the inconsistency in the first place. But are you willing to be truthful about that? That's the question here today. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support, my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, Chris, Grant, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, Kitboga, yep, the Kitboga, Matthew, Perry, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Chris, Craig, James, Jarrod, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Aquitar, Caleb, Dakota, Dan, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Jeremy, Jugs, Julie, Malcom, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. Would you consider joining these fine people?